So welcome everyone. Thank you for attending the first book festival. My name is Eric Borson. I am the treasurer and marketing chair for the festival itself. In addition to thanking our corporate sponsors, who we hope that you will visit, we'd like to also thank the wonderful folks here at the Inn at Saratoga for being able to host this wonderful session. Without their support, this festival would not have been possible. And for those who have not already visited Northshire Books, please be aware that recent titles of authors appearing throughout the festival are available for sale. We also have book plates available if you were not able to get a book ahead of this session, or Northshire has sold out of their books. Mark your calendars now, or we're planning our second annual book festival for October 22nd, 2022. That 10/22/22. Hope to see you again next year with a friend. And with that business out of the way, please help me welcome and thank our authors whose time and generosity during these uncertain times contribute the most to making this festival a great success. Since it has been said the founding fathers created this country while sharing beers in a tavern, we thought it was only appropriate to convene in a tavern to discuss how the Constitution might better serve Americans today while we sip a beer or two. So again, the bar is open if you have not already grabbed a drink now. And with us here today, two gentlemen who share some insight regarding how our Constitution should work to adapt the needs of Americans in each generation. So Beau Breslin is a professor and chair of the Department of Government at Skidmore College and a specialist in constitutional law and civil liberties. A PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in political science from the University of Pennsylvania, and a bachelor's of arts in political science from Howard College. He is the author of A Constitution for the Living. Has been an editor at Times, Spy, and other magazines. He is the author of the biography Commander Will Cushing, Daredevil Hero of the Civil War, and two novels, The Coup and Mr. Stupid Goes to Washington. Most recently, he served as senior speechwriter for Governor Andrew Cuomo, and now Governor Hochul. He and his family live in Clifton Park. So please round of applause for these two gentlemen.
So we're excited to see all of you here. I have had the experience of showing up at a book discussion and having no one show up. So this is just wonderful, and I congratulate you all. Thank you all for coming. Beau and I have talked this week about what would make the most effective presentation. He has written a very provocative and erudite book, but we thought rather than just chat about the book for an hour, we're going to talk about the book for a while. We'll have Beau come up, lay out the premise. He and I will talk a little bit to get some of the discussion going. And then, since so much of the book has to do with amending and evolving the Constitution, and so much of what's going on in our political life right now has to do with constitutional issues, we thought we would turn the discussion over to you, appoint you all delegates to the Constitutional Convention at Saratoga Springs, and we'll discuss some issues amongst ourselves. So let's have Beau.
Yeah, so thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Jamie. I'm used to teaching, so I stand. Thank you all for coming today. I'm honored and humbled by the turnout here for our book conversation. Let me take about what I hope is 5-8 minutes at the most to describe what the book is all about. This is A Constitution for the Living, Stanford University Press. It came out in April, and it's an unusual book, I think, in that it's a speculative history. So the premise of the book is this, pretty simple premise. There's a true story. There's a famous debate that happens between Madison and Jefferson at the end of the Constitutional Convention. Madison is done with the work in Philadelphia in September 1787, and he begins a correspondence that happens over 2 years with Jefferson, who's in Paris, right? Jefferson's not at the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson has a lot to say about the Constitution, and Madison writes to him, gives him a copy of the Constitution, and asks Thomas Jefferson what he thinks about the text. And Jefferson writes back, in classic Jeffersonian way, and says, "Oh, I like certain things about it, but I don't like other things. But the thing that really bothers me," Jefferson said, "is that there's no sunset clause on the Constitution." And he has this very famous line where he says, "The earth belongs to the living," and by which he meant that and he goes on to describe what he meant, but by which he meant every generation ought to write its own constitution. For Jefferson, the idea that a current generation, right, consider our iGen or millennials or whenever, a current generation kind of controlled by a bunch of dead white guys in Philadelphia is just another form of tyranny, Jefferson said, right? The reality is each generation ought to write its own constitution. And so he had this mathematical formula where he said basically every 19 years a generation turns over. So he's writing back to Madison and saying we should have a constitutional convention every 19 years. Madison writes him back and says, no, Tommy, that's just not right. Ultimately, Madison says, we need a constitution that endures over generations, over centuries, so that it builds up the necessary credibility for a stable political regime like the United States. It builds up the necessary reverence or legitimacy. So they were at odds their whole life on this topic. And Jefferson revisited it many times. This was in 1788, this correspondence with Madison. But Jefferson never, even before he died, he never gave up on the idea that each generation ought to write its own constitution. So with that said, my book is a simple counterfactual. What would have happened if Jefferson had won that debate, right? What would those constitutions have looked like in American history if Jefferson had won that debate? And what I do in the book is Jefferson said every 19 years, I was not going to imagine what a constitution would look like every 19 years. A, that would be tremendously boring, and B, a little indulgent. So what I did is I kind of took the spirit of Jefferson's idea and imagined what each constitution would look like if we took the life expectancy of the average American at the time of each constitution. So in 1787, the average life expectancy of an American white male, it happened to be, was 38 years. So my first imaginary constitutional convention was 1825, 38 years after 1787. The average life expectancy of Americans does not change in 1825. It's another 38 years. So the next constitutional convention, I imagine, is 1863. I'm not making that up, right? It's right in the middle of the Civil War. 40 years is the average life expectancy in the mid-1860s, so my next one is 1903, 1953, and then in 1953, the average life expectancy of American citizen was 69 years, so the next one is 2022, next year. So what I do in the book is, and it's not a typical academic monograph, I tell stories. Right? I'm not a storyteller by training, I'm a constitutional theorist by training, I'm a political scientist by training, but I tell stories of what would have happened at these 1825, 1863, 1903, 1953, and 2022 constitutional conventions. And I use real people, right? Daniel Webster is a major figure in 1825. There's no question he would have been at the Constitutional Convention, and he had certain things to say. You can imagine who's at the 1863 Constitution. 1903, Booker T. Washington, first person of color to be invited to a constitutional convention, Booker T. Washington. 1953, you've got Thurgood Marshall, you've got Gerald Ford, you've got people who are in various stages of their careers. 2022, I'll tell you 2022 was tricky, right? Because it's easy to use historical figures like Daniel Webster, who's long since dead. I have to use real figures in 2022, people who I genuinely would think would be at a constitutional convention. So I reached out to a lot of people. and a couple of them said yes. The one that I'll tell you about is this guy named Michael Rooney, who is the current president and CEO of the Sierra Club, was in the Bay Area. I wrote to him because there's absolutely no question in 2022 that one of the major things would be some clause in a new constitution about environmental protection. So I said, Mike, can you help me out? Would you participate as a delegate in my imaginary constitutional convention? He said, sure, and he did a phenomenal job. He and I were back and forth over email about what a clause in the Constitution that would protect the environment would look like. He did a phenomenal job. And so I tell that story too, 2022. So ultimately, the premise is just, what would happen if Jefferson had won that debate? He did not win the debate. Our Constitution is 234 years as of September 17th. But what would our constitutions have looked like in American history? And it's storytelling. So it's super fun. And ultimately, that's the description. I think I'll leave it there, Jamie.
Great. And I agree, super fun. And, I enjoyed very much reading it and seeing these figures pop up and show up. And I guess one of the first things that impresses me is that throughout this series of conventions, people are pretty well behaved. They are serious and they are high-minded and earnest. And I think there'd probably be a lot more pandemonium, particularly for the convention in 2022. It's hard to think of an atmosphere where not only wouldn't that be politicized, but politicized for years prior to it. You know? So that's one of the scary things about thinking that we would have to reimagine our Constitution.
Right. Yeah, so Jamie's absolutely right. On the one hand, it would be, imagine a constitutional convention next year. So just the nuts and bolts, the process, the procedural stuff would be amazing, would be incredibly tricky, especially in our polarized, what I would describe and other people describe as kind of this tribal political environment. First off, how do you make selections, right? For me, it was easy. It was easy to imagine the 1825, 1863, 1903, and 1953 constitutions, the Constitutional Convention, because they likely would have used the same mechanism, right? It's not inappropriate, it's not unreasonable for state legislatures to send their people like they did in 1787, right? But in 2022, that just wouldn't fly, right? Can you imagine if you work with Governor Hochul, can you imagine if Albany had to figure out who was going to go on behalf of New York State? Secondly, how many people, right? It made a big difference in 1787 to imagine that to understand that there were only 55 people who originally were there, 39 signed it. A smaller group makes a difference when you're drafting a constitutional convention. Right now, 2022, every interest group would want a place at the table. How do you figure out who's there and who's not there? The reason why I'm more sanguine, I'm more optimistic than Jamie seems to be, is because South Africa pulled it off in the mid-90s, right? It took a hell of a lot of time for South Africa to get the people at the table to write their new constitution, especially with the history of apartheid and that transition. And they were able to pull it off and have one of the great constitutions of the world. If they can pull it off, I think we might be able to.
In your 2022 example, you talk about crowdsourcing.
Correct.
Crowdsourcing ideas. Aren't you worried that Putin would end up writing our Constitution?
Yeah. So famously, one country tried to crowdsource its constitution. Iceland tried to crowdsource its constitution in the early 2000s, and it didn't actually go. But the idea was brilliant, right? And so I write about the fact that there would be some clamoring for crowdsourcing. And everything from, there would no doubt be some sort of Google app that you contribute to the delegation, the deliberations, to a Wikipedia type thing where you could go on and kind of change the Constitution and it would evolve over time. both of those would not work, but they'd be floated as ideas for a 2022 convention.
The idea of having a regular constitutional convention that redrafts the Constitution is, the appeal is on its face obvious. You get what the people want, what we want. But the sacrifice might be what Adams was bringing about, which was a kind of stability. And certainly I think, he got what he wanted, which was the stability, at the price of perhaps some classification. But we have figured out other ways to change things.
Sure.
The occasional amendment, congressional election, and one of the things that you talk about a lot is state amendments and state constitutions that evolve and kind of push the process along. I think that's fascinating.
Right. So one of the things that I can be a nervous guy, and one of the things that I was nervous about was credibility. I talked to Jamie about this. My credibility in doing this project was razor thin, right? Because it's a speculative history, right? And as an academic, we don't always love this kind of imaginary, made-up stuff, right? So I had to figure out what data I could use that would make for credible stories about these constitutional conventions. And the best data to use when you're thinking about this is state constitutional conventions. We've had 155 state constitutional conventions in our 200 and some odd years, right? 155 times states have come together in convention. That's not amendment, right? There's thousands of those, tens of thousands of those. But come together in convention 155 times. Some states have, like Louisiana has more than 10 times they've come together in there. And what is useful for me was that they're having conversations about the things that we would have conversations about at the national level. They're having conversations about power, right? They're having conversations about design. Do we go unicameral like Nebraska? Do we stay bicameral like the rest of the country? They're having conversations about rights. They're having conversations about slavery. They're having conversations that are kind of isolated to the state, but they have real national implications. And there's enough of those state constitutions, especially in the 19th century, that you can build a story about what would happen at the national level from that data. But it is, one of the things that's fascinating, then I'll turn it back to Jamie, is we had, of those 155 or so constitutional conventions at the state level, as many as 80 or 85% of them happened, maybe 80%, happened in the 19th century. And we have slowed down considerably. We haven't had a real constitutional convention at the state level here in maybe a generation or two across the country. But it was a very common thing in the first 125 years of American history.
Yeah, we kind of left it in the hands of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Toss the point. So last question for me is, what proposed constitutional reforms or amendments, if we all move down to Philadelphia, would you expect to see the big game changers?
Yeah, so one of the things that made this project timely is that there is a lot of conversation nowadays. A lot of it is in sort of academic circles, but there's a lot of conversation these days about constitutional reform. People are fed up with politics, and we've tried long and hard to kind of tackle dealing with the frustration about politics by focusing on the individuals in these political institutions and so on. Congress's job approval rating as an institution is, in the toilet. It's less than 20%. Ironically, most people really love their Congress member, but they hate Congress. So Paul Tonko's great, can't stand Congress. But there's been reforms about the Electoral College, right? People are frustrated by, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, people are frustrated by the Supreme Court's power. People are frustrated by how much campaigning has to happen at the presidential level. You basically have to start 2 years before, so how much policy making is really happening. People are frustrated by the imperial presidency. There's a lot of frustration. But in my lifetime, I'm 55, I look a lot younger than I actually am. In my lifetime, never have I seen this much attention on constitutional change ever. And so you have journals like The Atlantic who are out there saying, writing, devoting issues to constitutional change. Right? I participated in this super interesting experiment that was published in Democracy, which is apparently the Biden administration's new republic, right? This journal, Democracy. And we created a new constitution. The Constitution Center in Philadelphia, the great museum devoted to the Constitution, has this constitutional drafting project where they've asked various law school professors, I never understand why they only ask law school professors, but whatever, law school professors to draft constitutions. And then you have people like Chris Rock. I don't know if anybody saw, it was sometime, I think in October last year, when he was the host of Saturday Night Live. And go check it out. It's an 8-minute monologue at the beginning. And for a good 5.5 minutes of that 8 minutes, he's talking constitutional reform. He's saying, why do we have to have a president, right? So let's get rid of the president. And he's talking about constitutional reform. So it's even crept into pop culture, the idea of maybe we need to change the Constitution. So there's a lot of talk, this is all the lead up to Jamie's question, like which ones are the game changers, right? So there's a lot of talk about constitutional reform. I think some of them that people think are game changers are not going to be as big a game changers. Like, so many people inevitably go to the undemocratic Senate. It's ridiculous that California with 40 million people, 40 million, has the same number of senators as Wyoming with a little over 500,000, 80 times less than California. So people are like, oh, let's figure out a way to make the Senate a little bit more representative. That's low-hanging fruit for a lot of constitutional reformers. I don't think that's a game changer because Congress would have to change dramatically you eliminate the Senate, then it's a game changer. But nobody's talking about eliminating the Senate. I actually think a single-term presidency, not the current situation but the single-term 8-year presidency where you don't have to campaign, or a super interesting innovation is single-term presidency that's 6 years, and at the end of the 5th year, stay with me, it's complicated, at the end of the 5th year, there's a national referendum, you vote either up or down on the president, and if you vote up, the president gets an additional 2 years. But you're not running against anybody. The president's not running against anybody, he's just running against his, her, or their record. That would be super fascinating. Dealing with the president and modifying the president, I think, would make a big difference. I also think modifying the Supreme Court would make a big difference. One of the things that's interesting, is no doubt everybody in this room has seen it, is the Biden Commission on the Supreme Court has come out with some ideas, preliminary thoughts, whatever it is, they haven't done their report, but they're not inclined to add more seats to the Supreme Court, to go from 9 to say 12 or something like that. But they are inclined to recommend an 18-year term, non-renewable fixed term for Supreme Court justices. I think that would be a game changer for a variety of reasons that we can get into later. Things like the Electoral College, eliminating the Electoral College won't make a difference, and likely not going to happen. I think the game changers, Jamie, are the ones that are structurally radical, and in particular the ones that are presidency and federal courts as opposed to Congress.
Well, let's see what our delegates have to say. Beau and I have put together 7 questions. We probably won't be able to get through all of them. But yeah, I don't know if we have enough of these.
Share one.
But please look on together.
So these are legitimate reform
Yes,
proposals.
pass them around, and I bet you folks in the end are gonna have to fight for your questions, but.
Okay, guys. Peter? Okay. You good? I think we have enough for everybody, so. Instead of reaching over. We got two more.
So name a number between 1 and 7. 3. We're gonna do proposal number 3 first.
Okay.
Oh.
What? Oh, I'm very sorry. No, sorry, I'm very sorry. Sorry. Thank you very much. So, first one we're gonna talk about is proposal number 3. Do you have your copy up?
No, you're gonna have to read it to me, Jamie.
Okay, the first one is the one that talks about increasing the size of the Supreme Court. The very thing Beau said was never gonna happen. But this proposal, instead of just packing and adding things, makes a point of adjusting how we nominate them. So this proposal says we're going to raise the court to 15 justices. 5 will be appointed by Democrats, a Democratic president or a senior Democratic official, 5 by a Republican or a senior Republican official, and 5 will be appointed by those 10 justices. So the idea, I think the theory behind the idea is that it will create balance. That if they have to figure it out, they will try to pick people who will be reasonable and open-minded about the issues facing. So that is one of the
Legitimate proposal.
It's a legitimate proposal. It's there on the table. What do you think?
I would not vote for that.
Okay.
I think you are making it more partisan than it already is by limiting the terms and nominating each party having a certain number of nominees to the court, and the predominant criteria for selection is your party, as opposed to your academic, legal intellect, and scholarship, etc.
Well, more partisan than it already is. The Republicans had the presidency for half of the last, I forget the number, I'm sorry. In any event, for the last 50 years, and they've nominated 15 of the 19 justices. Or Jimmy Carter, 1 term, no appointees. Donald Trump, 1 term, 3 appointees. So, yeah.
I think you're reifying the two parties though. I mean, parties have risen and fallen throughout history, and if we decide Democrats are going to be the one party and Republicans are going to be the other party, it completely eliminates the possibility of change, of third parties rising.
Lots of ideas. Okay.
All I can think about is J-Cope here in New York State. If you want to look about allocating positions based on political parties, there's a non-starter for you.
Okay. Anybody want to speak in favor of this idea? Yeah.
I think we already have justices that are produced through a partisan system. So they're already partisan to begin with. So why deny it?
Right.
Choose them based on political parties. If we happen to come up with a third party, then we adjust with a convention of some sort.
Interesting.
Well, I think I'm in favor of this because I think, as we saw in the last few years with blocking of Merrick Garland onto his nomination, which was, I mean, it's just totally unfair. Merrick Garland's block obstruction